Right. So we're a bit early, but since this panel is chaired by a German, maybe we can afford to start early. Welcome to the last panel. My name is Christina Eichhorst. I am coordinator for counterterrorism and conflict management with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation based in Berlin, and I'm very happy to chair this panel that is now on Europe and European IS is a European network. Ever since the war in Syria started and young people from the West, from Europe, decided to leave their home countries in order to go to Syria and Iraq, everyone wondered why someone would decide voluntarily to leave a peace zone in order to go to a war zone. And I think that's not the special thing about the European case, because we heard these thoughts yesterday and today also. That's really something that is puzzling maybe everyone. What is special about Europe, I think, is that it was not only a foreign or a strange place people were drawn to, but it was also a strange and a foreign ideology they were drawn to. We heard yesterday from Guido Steinberg that this ideology, the Wahhabi, Salafi ideology, is nothing that is a Western one, and it's nothing that European would easily relate to. It's not rooted in European history, it's not rooted in European values, and it's not even pretending to be close to the predominant religion in Europe, the Christian faith. So it was for a long time, I think, easy to pretend that this phenomenon was something alien, something that didn't belong to Europe, something that was just simply imported. And maybe that has been true 15 years ago when Al-Qaeda started to really raise attention. But it is definitely no longer the case. It is by now deeply embedded in European societies, and I think we have to, or we already came to accept that. It is not only embedded in, it's not only about people with migration backgrounds, it's also an ideology that somehow raises the attention and draws people with a non-migration background to it. Plus, it's not only the individuals who decide to leave Europe to go to Syria and Iraq, we also have the networks that operate in Europe, and we have a certain milieu, families sometimes, not always, but sometimes, and friends who support these individuals. So this whole phenomenon has become an integral part of the cleavage structure of the European societies, and that's not only a sociological observation, but it has, of course, severe implications for the security of Europe, and it has major implications in terms of the threat level. It has implications in terms of the challenge to security authorities, in terms of challenges to the government to find responses, and also for the society as a whole to deal with this issue. So we want to discuss these challenges now with a focus on the question, what is IS's overall goal in Europe? What is its strategy? How do the networks function? And most importantly, we would like to discuss countermeasures that either have been taken or should be taken by governments. And we will have a closer look at France and Belgium, at Germany and the UK. And I think we will see, but I'm happy to wait for my panelists to judge about that. But we will see that there are different patterns, although we have, of course, a lot of commonalities among the European states with regard to this phenomenon. We also have different patterns in terms of attacks, the numbers of attacks we've seen, in terms of number and scope of the networks, and also in terms of the responses that have been taken. So I'm happy to have a panel here with three fabulous panelists. And I would like to now introduce to you the first one. It's Dr. Florence Gaub. She is from the European Union Institute for Security Studies based in Paris. She works on the Arab world with a focus on conflict and security and has a particular emphasis on Iraq, Lebanon, and Libya, and also lived here for 2 years, right? She works on Arab military forces more generally, conflict structures, and the geostrategic dimensions of the Arab region. And previously, she has then been employed at NATO Defense College in Rome and the German Parliament, and she wrote her PhD on the Lebanese army at Humboldt University in Berlin and holds degrees from Sciences Po Paris, Sorbonne, and Munich universities. So Florence, the floor is yours.
Thank you and good afternoon. I have a particular relationship with AUB. I was here in 2005 in the library when Rafik Hariri was assassinated. So this is a special place for me in a lot of ways, aside from the research component. Today, I want to talk to you about France and Belgium and the ISIS networks and their patterns that we observe there. I should clarify that I work for the European Union. I'm not a spokesperson, but I study a lot of European patterns. So while I concentrate in these remarks on France and Belgium, I think we have a general trend, and we can discuss this amongst the three of us or four of us later, that is a very European phenomenon. And I think that, in my opinion, that is not stressed enough, that we have to have a very European understanding beyond the mere national approach. Now, France and Belgium appear to struggle more than others, and I think the problem with that assessment is that while it's true, it distracts us from the broader European pattern. France is the champion in absolute European export terms, if you want to put it that way, so it has 1,900 French citizens and residents have traveled to Syria and Iraq or have tried to do so. Belgium is the proportional champion in that it's been only 500 Belgian citizens and residents, but proportionally to Belgium's population, it is the lead in terms of how many have traveled per million inhabitants. France and Belgium are also in the lead when it comes to terror attacks. You know that. I don't have to run through them again. So overall, it seems to be, it is actually a very big problem for the two countries. Just as an add-on, France has listed for the moment 15,000 citizens and residents as potentially radicals in its database. So there's a special database for this. This is quite an important number, as you can imagine. But if you take a look further, I mean, we're going to discuss the UK, we're also going to discuss Germany that have similar problems in absolute terms. We also have similar problems as Belgium in Denmark and in Sweden, two cases that are frequently overlooked in terms of small country, but still sending quite a large amount of citizens. Not anymore, as we know, that number has gone back, but have done so. So it is my conviction that we have to understand these motivations and these networks in a very European context. This is why I find debates around Islam as a motivator or the global struggle of Muslims and so forth a little bit misleading, because I'm convinced that a French citizen converting to Islam or supporting ISIS has very European motivations or very defined motivations that are context-specific. So I have lumped together the travelers and the non-travelers. A lot of the statistics we have are from the travelers, the foreign fighters. I decided to call them travelers and non-travelers because we increasingly see non-travelers, people that have not traveled to Syria and Iraq, still become active, be it passively or actively. Now, let's start with what they are not. I know it's very common to look at what they are, but let's try and let me play a few tricks on your stereotypes that you might have about this group of people. The first one is there are more women than you think there are. There are 30% women amongst French, up to 30% women amongst the French supporters of ISIS. And they're not, in contrast to the stereotype of ISIS, and that we like to buy into, they're not submissive housewives supporting their husbands. They have actually moved over to the operational side of things. There was just a foiled terror attack in Paris in September that was organized by an all-female cell, 3 women. One of them was a convert. That comes I'll come to that in a second point. So more women than men. It's overwhelmingly men, but it's still a very important number of women. The second point, what they are not, is that they're less Muslim immigrant than you might think they are, in the sense that I've just mentioned we have 30% converts. In France, a very interesting and puzzling statistic says that most of them are from Normandy and Brittany. If you've been to France, it's not exactly a stronghold of the stereotype of the Parisian suburb ghetto where you would find the best recruits. These are actually very, almost deserted landscapey areas. A lot of them come from secular households in the sense that the parents were not overly practicing their religion, if they were Muslims. We find both radicalization online and in Belgium a somewhat more tendency to be radicalized in person. You probably have heard of Molenbeek, which is a very good example for social networks where you recruit one individual that's a leader in that group and then manages to drag along several others. So we have that and online. In fact, I'm convinced that France and Belgium's ISIS component is less Muslim and more Arab in nature, something that is very often overlooked in this whole discussion about Islam. They are overwhelmingly from North Africa, and they're vastly underrepresented are, for instance, the Turks. Belgium has a very important Turkish community who is not participating, and also the Africans from sub-Saharan Africa, which are Muslims in France, do not join ISIS to the same extent. So there's a very distinct Arab component to it. Even if these young men or women don't speak Arabic, there seems to be an Arab identity playing into this. For the 70%, let's not forget the 30% that have no Arab ancestors. And then the last thing that they are not is they're probably younger than you think they are. Is anyone here under 25? I assume there's maybe a hand or two. Okay, so you are all potential recruits. Someone is cheating in the back of the row. Most of us are older than they are. And the reason I mention that is because it's a generational component that is very often overlooked. And I'll go back to that in a second when we talk about the Muslim community of France. So it's a very young cohort of 15 to 25-year-old people. Don't get any ideas for those of you who raised their hands. And the last point is they're probably not as poor as you think they are. I already mentioned Normandy and Brittany. We have a lot of middle class, lower middle class youngsters. So the stereotype of the young Arab Muslim boy from Clichy, suburb of Paris, being recruited into ISIS can hold, but it's not often the case. So the picture is much more diverse than the media make us believe. So what are they? Now, given the diversity of the picture, just one more point on the Belgian ISIS supporters. They tend to be more from cities than from the countryside. It also has to do with how people are distributed across Belgium. And before you believe it's all the Francophones, no, it's evenly distributed for once in Belgium between Dutch-speaking and French-speaking Belgians. So it's not, you could also be misled into thinking that maybe it's Francophone networks that stick to each other. So I have more puzzling elements for you than actually clarifying. So what they do all have in common is, however, or not all, but a lot, and that's something I see across Europe, is a strong link to petty crime. So not organized crime, but petty crime. 2/3 are known to the police before they become active in ISIS networks. If you look at the attackers of Charlie Hebdo, Paris November attacks, Thalys attack, from then the Brussels, first attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels, Brussels attack on airport, Malbec, all of them have been known to the police for petty crime. So we're talking low-scale drug sale, theft, sometimes armed assault and things like that, but nothing that would get you majorly into prison, although some of them go to prison. Here's the second point. Only 1/3 of them say themselves to have been radicalized in prison. So that's the other myth, you know. Oh, here's this poor guy, we send him to prison, and then he becomes radicalized. A few of them certainly do, but it's not as simple as that. In any case, there's nothing simple about the Islamic State. So in that sense, I agree with Olivier Roy, who says that it's less a radicalization of Islam and more radicalization and Islamization of radicalism. I'd go further, I'd say it's an Islamization of criminality. I think we have a strong component there, and we have to actually take a step back and understand criminal behavior writ large, which we don't do right now. And the last point is, and I think this maybe differs a little bit from the German case, is that the attackers that we've seen so far in France and Belgium were not lone wolves. Even the Nice attacker had, I think, 3 to 5 people in the background. So they all have a certain link to the ISIS network one way or the other. But you have to think of it more as McDonald's than as the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, in a sense that they get the brand, but they are self-organized and they follow a certain idea more than being funded from the same pot. In fact, it is better for ISIS, for a European cell to be self-funded, for instance, through the sale of drugs or fake sneakers or whatever, because this way they're undetected by law enforcement. All of the measures that we have so far to fight the financing of terrorism look at major funds being moved from A to B. When that's not the case, well, they fly under the radar. So because there's been no funds from abroad doesn't mean that there's no link to abroad in ideological terms. Now, let me move to the part of the problem that we are as Europeans. So first of all, structural stuff. Boring but matters. The decentralized structure of Belgium didn't help Brussels. If you look at the police that were dispatched to Molenbeek, the numbers were way too low. There was no supervision of the cyberspace in jihadist terms. Well, there was, but not enough. Networks like Sharia for Belgium that sent about 10% of the Belgians sent to Syria and Iraq were channeled through the system, were allowed to operate a lot longer than it probably should have. And in France, by the way, in both countries, the Muslim minority stands between 5 and 7.5%. If you ask public service, what do you think, how many Muslims live in your country? It's usually vastly overstated. Currently, Google fake news, French people believe that 30% of French population are Muslims, which is more than triple than the actual truth. This shows you the French malaise with this Muslim minority. And here I'd like to just briefly take a step back. We've had the 2005 riots. I don't know if you remember that, but if you look at the motivations that led to the riots around all the bigger French cities, analytically speaking, what united them to revolt against the French state was territory, language, religion, collective sense of rejection. So, in other words, everything that the Islamic State represents today. Only there was no Islamic dimension, no jihadi dimension to the riots of 2005. So I see a continuity of the problem. We as French haven't done our homework in that sense, but we have added a new color to it, and that is Daesh. And on the last point, Europe as a whole can do a lot more and is already doing a lot more. Structural issues that allow you to move. Schengen itself is not the problem, it's how the Schengen information system was or was not used accordingly. So if you allow me to just end on this video, because in my opinion we have the trilemma of Daesh recruitment in that sense. You have the individual level. Ultimately, radicalization is a highly individual process, a bit like a cult operates in tapping into your own, unwellness, or however you want to call it. But then you have the national level. You have a revolutionary mindset, you have a feeling of disenfranchisement and so forth, and you have the regional level, the global level that Daesh suddenly proposes. So what do we do in response? And we're fighting ISIS, obviously, in Syria and Iraq. France is doing a lot and Belgium as well in terms of deployment of soldiers, building new prisons, etc., etc. And lastly, it has launched a campaign that is called Stop Jihadism. And I'll show you a 2-minute video, and then we'll happily can discuss that in the Q&A, if you allow me, Chair. Just shows you how difficult it is for a state like France or Belgium to respond to a highly individualized process of radicalization, and how difficult it is to turn it around. So, just bear with me. So for those of you who don't speak French, it says, they tell you, and it juxtaposes what Daesh says and what the reality will be. Sorry for these images, but to give you an idea of what the French government tries to do, and maybe fails to do, I don't know, in the context of the fight against Daesh. And I'll stop here. We can discuss the rest later.
Very much. Thank you very much, Florence, for this first. It's not working. Now it's working, right? You hear me? Yeah? Okay, thank you very much, Florence. Yeah, we will discuss on that later. I'm now happy to introduce to you Florian Wetzel to my right. Florian is a researcher at the Institute for Security Policy at Kiel University, which is actually also my old university, so I'm happy to have you here on the panel. He focuses on security affairs in the Middle East, and currently he's working on a PhD project on the organizational dynamics of jihadist groups in Iraq and Syria. And he served as an analyst for a political risk consultant firm supporting projects in the Middle East and Southeast Asia for clients from business and the government and NGO sector. And he studied also at universities in Kiel and in Copenhagen, Arabic language in Damascus and Sana'a. So, and also you have a history in the German army. You served and participated in a reserve officer training program. So, Florian, I'm happy to give you the floor.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. First of all, I have to thank the Isam Fares Institute and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for the invitation to this very interesting conference. It's great to be here with you in Beirut. When we look at Germany, we can see a terrorist threat that has been growing and has also become increasingly more complex in the last couple of years. And I would argue that the terrorist threat that we are facing right now in Germany emanates from three main factors. That is, first, foreign fighters return from the battlefield. So far, 910 individuals from Germany have traveled to Syria and Iraq since 2012. The rate of departure of foreign fighters from Germany was around 100 a month in 2014 when the caliphate was established, but since then the number has significantly dropped because the caliphate has lost much of its appeal due to its military setbacks, but there are still people leaving Germany to join ISIS. And around 1/3 of these people who went to Syria have already returned to Germany, and there might be more returnees when ISIS continues to lose ground in this year. The second factor that contributes to the terrorist threat in Germany is homegrown radicalization. So basically the non-travelers Florence was talking about. The Salafi community has grown significantly in recent years in Germany, and there are around 9,700 members who belong to the Salafi community in Germany. And out of these number, there are around 1,000 Salafis who were considered violent by the Domestic Intelligence Agency in 2016. And what is remarkable is that despite ISIS becoming less attractive, it seems that has not affected the radicalization in Germany in a negative way. So radicalization that is associated with ISIS or a similar Salafi ideology continues to grow. And earlier this year, the domestic intelligence has increased the initial number of 1,000 violent Salafists to around 1,600 Salafists that are considered violent or potentially violent. And of those, and now it becomes a bit complex, there are around 600 or almost 600 Salafists who are so-called Gefährder. Gefährder is a working definition issued by the German police and describes people who are considered as capable of plotting terrorist attacks, so potential terrorists. And last but not least, refugees who either had been radicalized before they came to Germany or have been radicalized inside Germany constitute the third group that contributes to the threat picture in Germany. When we look at ISIS strategy in Germany or Europe in general, we shall not forget that for ISIS, the fight in the West or outside of its core territory in Syria and Iraq is just the sideshow. Unlike Al-Qaeda under Osama bin Laden, whose strategic priority was to attack the so-called far enemy or the West, ISIS' main interest lies at the home front in Iraq and in Syria. And so even though ISIS at least used to have a lot of resources back in 2014 and 15, they did not devote that many resources in terms of manpower and money to terror campaigns outside of its core territory, which is remarkably different from Al-Qaeda, I guess. So actually, ISIS could have done much more if they had wanted to. I would argue that the ISIS terrorist campaign in the West has been mainly designed to be extremely cost-effective. For instance, in Germany, and unlike in France, ISIS has relied largely on outsourcing terrorist plots to so-called lone wolves, a phenomenon I will talk about more in detail in the later part of my presentation. So the objective ISIS wants to achieve in Europe, and they have stated this very bluntly in their propaganda, is to eliminate what they call the gray zone. The gray zone, according to their understanding, consists of moderate Muslims who are living peacefully side by side with non-Muslims in Europe, so basically almost, or the vast majority of all Muslims in Europe. And to eliminate the gray zone, ISIS wants to polarize European society and push the Muslims into their camp, into the ISIS camp, while the rest of Europe, the non-Muslim, belong to the opposing camp or the camp of the unbelievers. We shall not forget that despite the rise of the ISIS caliphate and the support the caliphate has gained in Muslim communities across Europe, our democratic and pluralistic societies are far more attractive to Muslims than the ISIS caliphate. The very fact that Syrians who are seeking refuge are going to Germany, to Sweden, or to other places in Europe and not to Raqqa undermines the IS narrative that their caliphate is a shelter for Muslims who, according to their propaganda, are oppressed by the West. So what ISIS wants is to end our tolerance and inclusiveness towards Muslims. And the strategic logic behind their attacks, or of terrorist attacks in general, is that terrorism seeks to create an atmosphere of hatred and anger, which causes governments and also societies to overreact and strike back against those who are perceived as the terrorists, or at least those who are perceived as the terrorist supporters. And in the case of ISIS attacks, these are the Muslim communities in Europe. So ISIS wants to spread fear of Muslims so that Western societies alienate the Muslim community, and by doing so, radicalize them and drive them into the arms of ISIS. While ISIS may definitely not achieve this goal, they had at least some partial success. In Germany, we could witness a growing anti-Islamic sentiment that has been driven by right-wing populism, mainly because of the refugee crisis, but also because of ISIS attacks. And even though this conference deals specifically with terrorism or ISIS terrorism, I think it's nevertheless important to mention that we have witnessed over 900 right-wing terrorist attacks against refugee homes in Germany in 2015, and the same number in 2016. And I'm afraid that the growing Islamophobia in Germany, and also in other parts of Europe, may likely lead to increasing Muslim fear of marginalization, and as a consequence of that, to Muslim radicalization, and drives the Muslims into the arms of ISIS. When we look at the attacks that ISIS has used in Europe, we can see that there are two very different kinds of attacks or attack strategy they have chosen. There's first the attacks that have been organized by ISIS, such as the attacks in Paris and in Brussels, and attacks that have been outsourced, as I mentioned before, to lone wolves or individuals who are not really members of the organizations, but nevertheless act in the name of ISIS. So the first kind of attack is conducted by trained ISIS operatives, usually foreign fighters, who have been sent back to Europe to perpetrate terrorist attacks. And according to what we know, ISIS has an intelligence wing called the Amniyat, or the Amniyat al-Kharijiyya for external operations, in contrast to the Amniyat al-Dakhiliyya, who looks into the organization and controls the members, mainly. And this Amniyat al-Kharijiyya has been selecting and training foreign fighters in order to send them back to their home countries, where they would then plot attacks. And it appears that there is, or at least there used to be, a very significant smuggler network in in Turkey, where ISIS operatives, after having been sent across the border to Turkey, were equipped with cash and also smartphones on which encrypted messaging applications such as Telegram or WhatsApp have already been installed for to provide communication with the ISIS Amniyat back in Raqqa. So the ISIS operatives, after having been equipped with cash and cell phones, will then mingle among the refugee flow, which provided a perfect cover for them, and cross the Balkans until they finally reached Turkey. And throughout their journey, they would stay in contact with the ISIS Amniyat, and whenever they needed this support, ISIS would try to figure something out to help them. For instance, we know from the Paris attack cell, when they were run out of money, they reported back to the ISIS Amniyat that they needed more money, and then ISIS transferred, using Western Union or another money transfer service, money to a designated location for the attack team to pick the money up. So we don't have that many insights how the Amniyat actually works, and if they had also sent German foreign fighters back to Germany. However, what we know from at least one German ISIS returnee who was approached by the Amniyat while he was fighting in Syria, that ISIS was also looking for Germans who were willing to go back to Germany for terrorist attacks or to perpetrate terrorist attacks. And according to his testimony, the Amniyat couldn't actually find any Germans who were willing to go back, which does not mean that such a threat does not exist. Yet what we know is that ISIS has sent Syrian ISIS members disguised as refugees to Germany. So in September last year, police could identify and arrest 3 Syrian refugees in northern Germany who had been issued with fake passports that were issued by ISIS, and these fake passports came from the same forgery place where also the Brussels or Paris attack cell got their passports from. And this is the reason the police could identify these 3 ISIS operatives. But beyond this cell that has been dismantled in northern Syria, we don't know if there are any additional sleeper cells out there in Germany or not. The second kind of attack is conducted by self-starters or lone wolves who have never been full members of the organization, but who have been inspired by ISIS propaganda. And in most cases, these individuals have been in contact with ISIS and have received further guidance and instruction. So basically what ISIS does is they offer some kind of a hotline for anyone who can approach ISIS to get support in form of instructions and also motivation for terrorist attacks. Until now, we have witnessed 4 ISIS-related attacks in Germany, but only 3 of them were claimed by ISIS. All of them were lone wolf attacks, and all of them took place in 2016. The first attack in February 2016 is the one attack that is related to ISIS but not claimed by the organization, and this attack was perpetrated by a 16-year-old girl who stabbed and injured a policeman at Hanover Central Station. And even though this attack has not been claimed by ISIS, I think it's nevertheless important to mention it because the girl actually wanted to join the organization in Syria, but she was held back by her mother, and she then decided to perpetrate an attack in Germany. And what makes this case so unique and different from the other attacks that we have seen afterwards in Germany is that this 16-year-old girl was the only one among the attackers we have later witnessed it, or we had later came up in Germany, who actually lived according to a strict Salafi lifestyle. And in addition to that, she was also the only German. All other attackers were refugees or asylum seekers and had not did not appear to be very religious. In July, there was a second attack conducted by an Afghan or Pakistani refugees. The authorities have not yet figured out where he actually came from. And he attacked 4 foreign tourists in a train in Würzburg and injured them with a knife and a hatchet. A few days later, the second attack, or the third attack, but second attack claimed by ISIS, took place in the city of Ansbach in southern Germany when a Syrian refugee tried to conduct a bomb attack on a music festival that took place there. And the Ansbach attacker, for his attack, built a very simple makeshift explosive device, and it appeared that he accidentally killed himself or triggered his bomb in advance before he could reach his destination and plant his bomb at the music festival, and he only killed himself by doing so. But we have also experienced that lone wolf attacks can be quite deadly when the attack proceeds according to the plan. And that was the case when Anis Amri, an asylum seeker from Tunisia, drove a truck that he had stolen into a Christmas market in Berlin in December last year, killing 12 people. And even though individual attacks are usually very primitive, they involve makeshift weapons such as knives, axe, or in this case of the Berlin Christmas market attack, a truck. They can be quite deadly, and I think the Berlin attack is a good but very tragic example for that. Inspired attacks by individuals fit very well into this ISIS strategy of low investment because the attacks are very cheap, seen from the perspective of the organization, and relatively easy to perpetrate, and they do not pose any risks to ISIS. But looking at from the perspective of ISIS, the problem with such a kind of attack strategy is that they rely on independent people to motivate themselves. So that does not give ISIS any control over this attack strategy. Seen from a perspective of counterterrorism, lone wolf attacks are very difficult to prevent because the perpetrators are almost impossible to identify. And that is also because they do not, or seems to do not have the typical traits that are associated with jihadism. And Florence also mentioned that before. And I think Anis Amri, the Berlin attacker, the Berlin Christmas market attacker, he's a very good example for such a kind of lone wolf we have seen emerging across Europe. So he appears to be somewhat like a drifter who was very difficult to grasp, even for the security agency, because he moved between different worlds. At times, he was very close to radical Salafism. He was connected to the notorious Abu Wallah network, a network that had mobilized a number of foreign fighters until it was dismantled. And at other times, he was partying very hard. He was involved in petty crimes, and he also took drugs himself. And even though he appeared on the radar of the security forces, or the security services in Germany, they assessed him not as a significant threat because of his sinful lifestyle. And this appeared to be a gross misunderstanding of the type of lone wolf we are facing or we are dealing with right now in Europe. I could talk even longer, but I leave more room for discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florian. Thank you also for highlighting the issue of right-wing extremism in Germany. It's not in order to be politically correct, but I think it's important to highlight it because it poses a real threat to the security situation in Germany, and also it points towards something that Mubarak, I think, will also talk about. It's pointing at the issue of trying to find the right responses to this security threat while not occurring on rights of freedom and speech and putting the rule of law into danger. So I know that will be something you will talk about. But first, let me introduce you. Mubarak Ahmed is an analyst at the Center on Religion and Geopolitics with an academic background in Arabic and Islamic studies from SOAS University of London. And he is focusing right now with his research on Islamist extremism online and pathways to radicalization. He has written and has appeared on several international and national media outlets, and he co-authored just recently, I think, a groundbreaking report into the accessibility of extremist content via the Google search engine. And he has briefed on that topic government audiences in London, Brussels, and Washington. So, Mubarak, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to, first of all, thank the hosts, Cass and AUB. It's been great the last 2 days to hear all these different perspectives and really joining the dots on what is a global phenomenon. But it's good to see all these ideas coming together, and hopefully we can have some good solutions at the end of it. I think, as Florence touched on this, there are certain trends which emerge across a European context. But I'd like to start off by saying that, in my opinion, while there are trends, the UK context is different. Now, this is partly due to the UK, thankfully, not having suffered an ISIS attack thus far. It's also to do with the demographics and the ethnic makeup of the UK's Muslim population, which, unlike France and Belgium, is not made up of Arabs, but predominantly South Asians. But it doesn't mean it's that different, and we can talk about Brexit as being another difference, but we'll leave that for another conversation. But the UK's history with violent extremism, at least certainly before the ISIS period, would be marked by 2005, where we saw an Al-Qaeda-linked attack on 7/7 across the transport network in London. And I suppose that was the start for the UK government at the time to have these conversations around religious extremism, around terrorism, and what it means within a UK context. But I won't stray into that too much today, but hopefully it'll all link in during my presentation. So, as far as ISIS networks in the UK go, security services have highlighted the Walsall cell as being the most extensive network that was discovered in the UK. So Walsall is a place in the middle of England, just outside Birmingham, and this network, or this cell, consisted of 8 men and 6 women. I think, rather like it was mentioned in the French case, I think we underestimate the role of women in these networks. So not all of these individuals travelled, but the first person among this group who did travel was a man called Jacob Petty. Now this example is partly cited because I think it highlights all the key points. I think if you do any further reading into this cell, you have men, women, converts, prison time, university, all the different trends that we do come across is present in this cell. But also because Jacob Petty is someone who I went to university with. That's not something to smile at. Jacob Petty was someone who I spoke to briefly. I wouldn't call him a good friend or something, but he was in my class at university. Seemed like a nice enough guy. He was a convert to Islam. His mother was a vicar with the Church of England. And he seemed like any first-year university student. But the more I read into this story, it became intriguing how somebody so, on the face of it, so ordinary, how could they be linked to what is the world's biggest terrorist phenomenon? And I think for me, it certainly hit home, and it challenges our preconceptions about what is a terrorist and how do we view these individuals. But the other interesting part of Jacob's story is that prior to traveling to Syria, he tried to join al-Shabaab in Somalia. So this highlights for me whether it's actually ISIS itself or is it just what's accessible, what's in fashion at the time. And we'll go on through this and you'll see how, in my opinion, existing networks in the UK, networks that have survived for decades, that is the crucial point. I think that's where the focus should be. As for the ISIS-related numbers, there are 850 Britons who are believed to have travelled to Iraq and Syria. That's a number that's corroborated by a number of organisations as well as the Sufan Group. And the rest of the data is from the BBC's open source database on British jihadis. So half are believed to have returned to the UK, while 73 are believed to have died while in Syria or Iraq, with at least 85 believed to be still there. This is in no way conclusive and is reliant on the availability of open source information. And obviously 91 have been convicted for terror offences relating to Syria and Iraq. This includes those who may not necessarily have travelled, but were supplying funds or equipment to those who were there. The main focus of my presentation will be this one group, Al-Muhajirun. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you all are with Al-Muhajirun, but it was founded back in 1996 by Omar Bakri Mohammed, who is incidentally in prison here in Lebanon. He was kicked out of Saudi Arabia for trying to start his own caliphate-seeking group in the 1980s. He found sanctuary in the UK, and after eventually being ejected by another pan-Islamist group that seeks a caliphate, Hizb ut-Tahrir, he set up Al-Muhajirun along with his followers in the UK. And this organisation has been on the government's radar for some time. We see that it's operated under a number of different aliases. It has been known by Islam for UK, Al-Ghuraba, Need for Khilafah. But essentially, the network has survived over decades. You could say Anjem Choudhury, who's the leader of the group, has been at the head of this for most of this time. He was in prison last year, and I'll talk more about him later on. But essentially, these networks that were set up in 1996 or maybe informally before that, in one form or another, have continued to survive. And more interestingly, they've been linked with attacks in a number of different geographic locations over time. It's not just about ISIS. It hasn't just been ISIS that has brought al-Muhajirun to the fore. And in terms of how recent the activity is, just in February this year, 5 men from Luton were convicted on terrorism charges, and they were hosting events supporting al-Muhajirun, calling for a caliphate. I think, in fact, one of the individuals that was sentenced was calling for 40 trucks of bombs to be driven down Oxford Street, which is one of Europe's biggest shopping destinations. So just as an outline, I mean, I'm not going to delve too much into ideology and start throwing phrases like Salafism and Wahhabism around right now. I think we'll leave that for a separate conversation. But essentially, al-Muhajirun's objectives, and bearing in mind these objectives were in place from 1996, long before the ISIS caliphate was on the horizon. They sought to overthrow the government, establish a Islamic caliphate as they saw it, and to institute the Sharia as state law. And obviously, going in line with the ISIS rhetoric of expansion, that was also on the agenda. Now, the images that you see, these are demonstrations that have taken place on the streets of London in the last decade or so, and kind of sums up their attitude and how they see British society around them. Now, there's some attacks that I've put on this timeline to illustrate where al-Muhajirun has been linked, whether it's a direct involvement, although it maintains its non-violent. The shoe bomber Richard Reed back in 2001 was linked to Omar Mohammed Bakri, who was the founder of the group. The Mike's Place suicide bombing on the beachfront in Tel Aviv, that was linked to Omar Khan, who was again linked to al-Muhajirun. The 7/7 bombings, which was the UK's wake-up call for understanding terrorism and extremism, again linked to this same group. So over time, over the span of almost 2 decades, we've seen involvement from this one group in a number of different types of attacks for a number of different groups. Obviously, 2014 marked a massive shift in the movement because you now have a territorial base with ISIS's caliphate, and we've seen up to 500 individuals linked to Anjem Choudary and al-Muhajirun in particular travel to Iraq and Syria. Now, 500 out of 850, that's over half linked to a single group. As I mentioned, Anjem Choudary, for those of you familiar with the UK context, he's somewhat of a celebrity when it comes to Islamists in the UK. He was born in the UK, he studied law at university. He wasn't a particularly religious person at university. There's some rather questionable pictures floating around on Google of what he used to get up to, but he was radicalized by Bakri, and he has since been a key supporter and a key leader of the al-Muhajirun group. Again, he's been linked to 15 terror plots in the UK since the year 2000. And when he was sentenced to 5.5 years in prison last year, it came to light that security services believed that 500 individuals had some contact or had some influence from Anjem Choudary. Now, given his legal background, he's been very successful up until last year in evading the legal system. He's known what to say, what not to say, how far he can push it, and really testing the boundaries of a liberal Western democracy when it comes to freedom of expression, and basically airing his beliefs. He's always pushed things very far, and there's always been calls for arresting him, but there's never been enough ground to do that. His calls for the caliphate have been going on for decades, and when ISIS shows up and he's still supporting this caliphate, and in fact he sees it as the embodiment of what he would like to create, that is what it has taken for him to be off our streets. So as far as I'm concerned, there isn't an optimistic note for me to end on and say, if we defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria and any other territory where it currently holds ground, that it will have a direct impact. I think these informal, loose networks like al-Muhajirun, Sharia for Belgium, I think Pierre Vogel's group in Germany, these groups and these networks, it doesn't matter what name you give them, it doesn't matter whether you proscribe them or not, these loose networks continue to survive. And as we've seen with the flow of foreign fighters, they do play a heavy role in the number of individuals that travel. So I think that's something that will continue. I think if a new group emerges, whether it's in the Middle East or elsewhere, if a new conflict hub opens up and it becomes an attractive location for those wishing this form of governance or this form of life, I think we are likely to see another mass migration of foreign fighters. And then you add to the mix the returnees. As I mentioned, in the British context, half of the 850 are believed to have returned to the UK. So there's also the challenge of how you deal with them, whether it's de-radicalization, integration, whatever approach the security services take, you have to juggle that on one hand, but also these existing networks and the likelihood that they will continue to grow and flourish as time goes on. And in terms of solutions, I think I'm perfectly open to having a much longer discussion about this afterwards. But for me, I think monitoring is a key part of this. There shouldn't be any surprises. I'm not quite sure whether it should be based on whether somebody's school of thought is following Salafism or one other particular thought. I think that's a questionable way of doing things, but I think it's important to understand how these networks operate, where they're operating, where they're recruiting, activities on university campuses, college campuses. Are we aware of these? Are we aware where the influence of these groups lies? Isolation. So key influences. It's hard to, in my view, it's rather reckless to put petty criminals in with known hardened ideologues and influencers. Someone of the capabilities of Anjem Choudary, who has been linked to 500 individuals, I think it would be reckless from any government's perspective to stick him in with those who are there for drug charges, gang violence and robbery. But it's good to see that the UK government has taken steps, and Anjem Choudary was one of the first prisoners who they decided would be kept in isolation for that very reason, that he doesn't influence others while he's inside. I think there has to be an engagement with the ideological side of things as well. There was a great discussion following on from Guido's presentation yesterday about ideology and the impact that it has. And I think we do need to have that engagement. I think more so now we see a rise of populism. These conversations about Islamism, extremism are constantly being taken up by those on the fringes. And until our mainstream policymakers engage in that conversation, I think we run the risk that the extremes will dominate the space. The last one is one that even troubles me when I try and think of how we can come to a constructive solution. But this crossover between non-violent and violent words and deeds, it makes me uncomfortable to think about banning an idea. But I think we do need to have an awareness that we simply shouldn't be dealing with the violent end of spectrum. It's not just about dealing with terrorism. For me, violence is a symptom of an ideology that lies beneath. And until we can have a greater awareness around the relationship between words and deeds, I think we'll continue to struggle in understanding how this group operates and how it feeds into the much larger global jihadi movement. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vas. We will now have 40 minutes for questions and answers, and I already see several hands raised. Please, the gentleman over there.
Thank you to the panelists. I'd like to ask a question about the issue of surveillance of radical individuals who are known to the security services. So a good example of this is Jamal al-Harith, who, as you know, was a British former detainee in Guantanamo Bay, was then released and then ended up traveling to Syria in 2014, and then last month blew himself up in Mosul. As non-specialists looking at these sort of cases, it's just rather curious to see how these sort of individuals are able to slip through the cracks. So I'd just be interested to hear your insights into how these things happen.
And that question was directed at
to answer.
Okay. Guido, please.
I've got a comment on Florian, of course. I think I don't agree with your definition of a lone wolf. A lone wolf, according to my definition, is somebody who has no connection whatsoever to an actual organization and who is inspired, maximum inspired by this organization. And if you adopt that definition, there has been no lone wolf in Germany, and probably hardly anyone in Europe, only in the United States. You don't have to agree, but I think you should differentiate between real lone wolves and false lone wolves that you have mentioned. All the guys you have mentioned, all the people, including the girl, Safia Schmitter, had extensive contacts with the organization IS. They were contacted. In some cases, we do know how they did that. In some other cases, we don't know. But there were extensive contacts, and the main difference, I think, from the perspective of a well, let's say, former practitioner is that you have a chance to catch these people because they communicate electronically. So in all these cases, there was a decent chance to catch them, but they were not caught. Yes, our government tends to talk of lone wolves in order to make the claim, well, there was no chance. There were chances, but our security services plus our allies are not able to monitor these people anymore. That's my first point. My second point is about strategy. I think if you take a look at the plots that failed or were foiled, the picture is a little bit different. We did have big plots. You have mentioned one of them. I'm not sure exactly which one you talked about, but we did have big plots along the lines of Paris, November 2015, which failed or were foiled by the authorities. And that might counter your argument that IS was not really investing in Germany. First, they sent back recruits. We do know that, more than one. And there is more than this evidence. The problem was that the Germans got cold feet. Fair enough, that is when ISIS decided to send false refugees, Syrians, Pashtuns, North Africans. And there are two big plots at least, one in Düsseldorf, which failed because one of the perpetrators, he opted out, and another one in Berlin, in central Berlin. And you have mentioned that the organization invested heavily. And I think you contradict yourself to a certain extent. An organization that sends scouts on the Balkan route to Germany, an organization that sends at least dozens of personnel to Germany, France, Belgium, Sweden, Austria, does invest heavily. It invests manpower that it can make use of on the battlefields of Iraq and Syria. So my interpretation is that Germany wanted to follow the same strategy as in France, but it failed in Germany because it lacked the personnel, the local personnel, and secondly because security services, at least in some cases, did their job. Not necessarily the German ones, but friends and allies.
Yeah, let's stay in that corner, and then we go to the different corner later on.
My first question is for all of you, I mean any of you. We do believe that there is an integration problem for these recruits, right? And at the same time we see the biggest providers or reserves of these ISIS fighters or these Islamist, let's say, extremists are the biggest European powers also. Brits, German, and France, for example. Does it have something to do with, I mean, do you see any relation between that? And I also would like to refer to one of the research works conducted by Dr. Steinberg, who is right behind me. One of the hypotheses that he raises is that after every conflict in Islamic world, and after every Western intervention in Islamic world, you see jihadist scene development in Western world. I mean, you see a lot of development. What's your opinion about that?
Okay, and one last question, and then I would like to give it back to the panel.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panelists. I grew up in Africa, and for the past 15 years, I used to think of Africa as a continent where leaders seek things that require logic through illogical means. But for the past few years, I realized that no, it is not only in Africa that this can be illustrated. Madame Florence mentioned the Islamization of radicalization. And Mr. Florian showed, or anyway, talked about the risk of this state of things, or such discourse creates more and more radicalized youth. At the same time, the leading world, the most powerful countries, including countries in Europe. I can illustrate with examples from any of the countries represented by the panelists. We have strong opinion leaders who campaign with extremist discourse while governments are trying to find ways to fight against terrorism, which is absolutely a crime that should and must not be linked to any ethnicity, to any nationality, and to any religion. And we have campaigned from strong politicians who seek power, but first thing to do when they come is to ban, destroy all the mosque, and ban a religion. I would like to know, with clear examples from each one of the countries represented, more than the video that Madame Florence showed, which for me, yes, it is something, but its effect or impact on radicalized person is very limited. So what is being done concretely? I like the set of recommendations made by a panelist, Mubaraz, which are strong ones and very good ones. And it's unfortunate to know that only now such recommendations, that until today, these steps are still investigated for recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I would like to give back the floor now to the panelists, and I would like to start with Florian.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have to respond to the 2 points Guido Steinmetz made. First, the question of lone wolf is very much a question of definition, whether you call them lone wolves or not so lone wolves or false lone wolf. I think what is important, doesn't matter whether you want to call them, is that they are largely moving on their own initiative. And it's true that almost all of them have been in contact with ISIS virtually, but they were acting largely on their own. That's at least to my understanding. So I think I also use the term self-starters, and I think this might be a better term to use in this case. The second point that was mentioned is the point of resources, or the resources ISIS invested into terrorist attacks in Germany. And I think that I only mentioned the successful attacks. I didn't talk about the plot, the foiled attacks. But nevertheless, even if you count the attacks that had been foiled in Germany, I would still argue that the investments ISIS made in terrorist attacks in Germany or in Europe or in the West in general was far less than they could have actually done, because it was not their strategic priority. Strategic priority for ISIS is in Iraq and in Syria. This might change. The group might adopt a more outward-looking strategy or more outward-looking posture in the future, like Al-Qaeda did in the 1990s, but they haven't done it yet. And that's why I would still argue that they following a very low investment or low resources strategy. I hope that was okay. To counter radicalization?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can say something about counter radicalization, and I like to make a point on how to counter radical ideology, whether it's jihadi ideology or right-wing ideology or another radical ideology. I think, and I like to offer a different perspective. I think it's very difficult to counter radical ideology, because radical ideology, whether it's religious ideology or any other political ideology, radical ideology will be always out there and will always be accessible for anyone. So instead of thinking about how we can counter radical ideology with counter narratives or through other mechanisms, we should think about something else, I guess. And when we look at jihadist ideology became big in the late 90s 60s, early 1970s. And since then, we haven't seen a continuous growth of jihadist fighter mobilization, but always waves of jihadi fighter mobilization. And these waves of mobilizations were triggered by conflicts that provided an opportunity for jihadists to fight. And I think what we need to do is to deny the access to the battlefield, so that foreign fighters cannot go to these conflicts and fight there. If we do that through different mechanisms such as increasement of border control, improved intelligence sharing on the international level, and also the dismantling of recruitment networks, I think then we can cope with international jihadist mobilization of foreign fighters much better in the future than we had done in the past. I think it was just another perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Florence, would you like to answer the questions?
I try to see my notes in the dark. So let me connect your two questions, because what's being done really, both in surveillance terms, hard security and flanking issue measures. The first is that now, according to the fichier that the French authorities have compiled, we are now speaking about 15,000 that would, in theory, have to be surveilled as of today. Of course, the focus is on those that return from Syria and Iraq, which are about 750. If you think that for each individual you would need several policemen 24 hours a day, that makes it a rather large number. And right now the French police is recruiting more and more people and beefing up their capacities, but it's simply not something, first of all, they can do in terms of capacity, but there's also a legal issue. Now, we have a state of emergency, so in theory we can do not whatever we like, but that speeds a few things up. But let me add a few other facts to your question. In addition to what the Ministry of Interior has been doing, there are 7,000 soldiers deployed across France, and you can actually speculate whether that deters the terrorists, or, as we've seen in Orly a few days ago, actually attracts them, because now you have soldiers walking around with heavily loaded guns in the metro. The other thing that's been done is there are more prisons being built, echoing also some of the really deplorable conditions in French prisons. And those that are convicted, it's about half of those that have come back now are on trial or have been convicted. 350 will be spread out over 27 different locations. That's just a number. But your real question was, why did they manage to slip under the radar? Well, I think one thing we don't talk about is those who haven't slipped under the radar, because since 2015 there have been 10 terrorist attacks in France foiled that we never talk about. For instance, during the Euro Cup. Because you don't want to create even more public anxiety, you don't talk about those terrorist attacks that you have foiled. But for those that have slipped through, like Abaoud, the Paris attacker mastermind, he left, and we know that he left France, that he went to Syria, that he came back through Germany. This is one of the problems I mentioned at the European level. There is not even a European standard on how to spell Arab names. So I think the German authorities ran that test where you put, a random Arab name into a German database. It will be the same person but spelled differently in Germany than in France or in Italy and so forth. So that this is sometimes really silly obstacles like that that make it more difficult. Of course, they used also forged passports, and if you've been to Europe, you know that, and even still now, you can still easily travel from Brussels to Paris without ever meeting a police officer. Famously so that the Paris attacks concentrated all the attention of the security forces on Paris, so that some of the attackers managed to escape to Belgium. Now, I'm not saying that that's not a blunder, but I think you do see an institution that is facing a challenge that they have never faced at this scale. And then the other thing is, of course, that the link between petty crime and terrorism is not recognized to that extent. And also we have a rights issue. You can't just crack down on the petty criminals as if they were already terrorists. So I mentioned all the attackers had been known to the police, but not for terrorist crimes. So the two attackers from the Paris attacks had a bar in Brussels that was shut down for selling drugs. So you can't start putting a surveillance team on them just because they do something that a lot of people do without going wildly against terrorist laws. So I think that's one issue. I also already mentioned the Belgian authorities being overwhelmed, the decentralization of the Belgian system, which means that Molenbeek was a bit of a world apart from the rest. And I think at the last point, to go back to your question, what's being done? At the French level, there are everything that I mentioned just now, the security component measures, but there are also measures to create jobs, because really this is one of the issues. And there is a somewhat controversial de-radicalization program. If you sign up for it, you go to some place outside of Paris and you learn a few things about citoyenneté. And I smile because I struggle a little bit with that. The reason I struggle with that is because I'm convinced that radicalization is a fundamentally individual process. And therefore, de-radicalization is a fundamentally individual process. So it's not because someone teaches you about liberté, égalité, fraternité that you suddenly change your mind. So I think it's a largely inherent process that has to happen inside you, and I'm not sure campaigns like the one you've seen can do that. One discussion I had with people from the French Interior Ministry was, I said, well, are you sure that someone watches that video and says, oh, okay, now I get it, it's actually just all a lie? And he said, no, but maybe the message is also one to the French public to communicate we're doing something. But one issue, I think, or one aspect of this campaign that is worth mentioning, and I think has been rather successful, is there is a hotline, a green line, where you can call, not to denounce someone, but to seek advice for when you see someone in your environment displaying tendencies that you think might lead to radicalization. And guess who's calling the most is the moms, the mothers. 3,000 calls so far. So what happens is they won't get tailed by the police, but the mother will get advice on how to react, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is the type of community engagement we need much, much more. Can I just answer the last question on the integration problem, because it goes back to that. This was your question. Yes, there is an integration problem. We can't beat around the bush. The problem is that when we look at the French cohort of ISIS supporters, that it's not just an integration problem, because 30%, so 1/3, are not of Arab Muslim stock, so to speak. They have chosen to be to convert and to be part of that narrative. But if we look at the 70%, we have some indications. The first thing is that most of them are second generation. So why is it always second generation? Why is it not first generation? Why is it not third generation? So there's something going on with the second generation. So I don't know what it is, but there is an issue here. The second thing is there's been a huge survey done recently. I think you had a similar one in the UK on values amongst the Muslim community of France. You know, it's 3 to 4 million people. And it turns out that the vast majority feel like the vast majority of French people do, but 30% feel that laïcité, you know, the neutrality of the French state towards religion, is a mistake, and that there should be more Sharia elements to public law and so forth. Now, that's a minority, a big minority, but the main problem is that it's clustered in the younger people, so under 25. And that's what I said earlier about the generational issue. That's why I also have a problem with the big narrative, le grand discours of Islam. Because if in France we have le grand discours with the imams of the mosque that the young guys don't go to and don't listen to anyway, then we're missing, I think, the major issue. So I'm not saying ideology doesn't play a role at all, but I think in our reaction we need to really dissect. And one thing I see, in addition to unemployment, in addition to the second generation, I see ghettoification. And I think that was a reason why I mentioned 2005. One thing you see in France, more so than in Germany, I don't know so much about the UK, but is that you have certain communities that live really closed off. If you've been to Paris, it's this ring around Paris where you have really homogenous societies, parallel societies developing, where if you grow up there, you live in a value echo chamber, and you will find it difficult to reach out to other parts. Now, everyone's guilty of that. I live in an echo chamber too. But this is where French housing could be done differently, social housing in particular. In 2005, one of the narratives, and I lived in Paris at the time, was, look at Frankfurt. I'm half German. Look at Frankfurt, they've done it so well. No German thinks that Frankfurt is a good example of social housing. But by French standards, it is, because social housing is scattered all across the city. So you don't have a whole part of town being populated by unemployed young boys with absent fathers, but they live in smaller communities across the city. Last point, you mentioned the big countries. Well, they are the biggest countries, so they, numerically speaking, send the most. But if you turn it upside down and think how many out of 1,000 go to join ISIS, then it's not France or indeed Germany that's leading. It's Belgium, it's Denmark, it's Sweden, and Austria. So I think the colonial narrative plays a role, but it's added on later. So when you're already in the victimhood, suppressed, rejected mindset, then if you're in France, you add colonialism on top, but that doesn't work if you live in Austria, for instance. Doesn't make it less prevalent, but I think we have to be careful not to put the cart before the horse. For now, stop.
Thank you very much, Laurence. If I may just add with regard to the social housing question, I think Germany has done quite well. We don't have the kind of banlieues you have in France, although of course we also have these difficult quarters. And I think we really see now a challenge when it comes to the housing for refugees, to the question of how to accommodate them and how to deal with this issue. So still a way to go also in Germany. But Munich, I was told, has the stipulation that everywhere where a new housing project is constructed, you have to have a certain amount of social housing being part of the whole construction project. So maybe that is a practical approach to this issue. So, Mubaras, please.
I'm going to start off with the integration question first. I think it's important to observe how the countries that you cited, based on what the panel discussed, Germany, France, I'm not sure about Belgium, and the UK, traditionally have adopted very different integration models. So in Germany, the predominant makeup is Turkish Muslims who came over as workers. In France, as Florence mentioned, it was remnants of the colonial period. The society they were going into was the typical French secular society that we're all aware of. And in the UK, you have this concept of multiculturalism, where all cultures are accepted and they're expected to get on with their ways. Yet, in every single one of these contexts, we've seen a flow of foreign fighters. I think while there is an issue, and you're quite right to point out that the big European countries have had these foreign fighters, I don't think you can say I don't think you can put your finger on exactly what the integration model is. And that leads me on to my other response, and hopefully it will answer some of yours as well. Last year, London elected a Muslim mayor. I repeat that. London, a city that is undergoing massive political turmoil with Brexit and all the populism that's riding around it, elected a Muslim as its mayor with the largest political mandate in British political history. Right? In terms of Yaya's question about what are the options out there, and I agree with my fellow panelists about counter-narratives and alternatives, well, this is the alternative. Whether it's politics with people like Mo Farah, Baroness Wasi, Sajid Javid, the list goes on. These people were part of David Cameron, a Conservative Party's cabinet. Muslims are able to reach those ranks. Why are we not making a bigger song and dance about that? I don't know. But when we talk about lack of aspirations, and to this day, Muslims make up the lowest socioeconomic group in the UK. I think these are the examples that should be cited when we talk about social mobility and addressing some of the societal concerns around it. And it extends to other worlds. I'm a big sports fan, so Mo Farah, again, an immigrant from Somalia, probably wouldn't be allowed in the US at the moment, but a positive example, a positive alternative to what ISIS is. Let's embrace the grey zone. In terms of UK-specific responses, I think in 2015, David Cameron, while he was still Prime Minister, took in the views of many, a bold step, and he openly spoke about ideology in his counter-extremism strategy. And he did this quite fittingly at a school in Birmingham where some individuals had left to join ISIS. I think that, for me, is a big step that the UK has taken from a government level to understand that there is an ideological component to what we're dealing with. That doesn't ignore the other aspects that feed into this. That doesn't ignore the other push factors or the pull factors that we're working against. But I think recognizing ideology is perhaps, I think Britain was one of the first countries to do that. I think that was a positive measure. But to be fair, I'm not sure how that will play out in the next few years, given that Theresa May, who also wrote the foreword for that document, seems to have been quiet on that issue given Brexit. So I'm not quite sure how thoroughly the government will follow through with that. As I mentioned in my presentation, the UK's involvement in this area began post 7/7 in 2005. I remember Hazel Blears, who was a cabinet minister at the time, she was tasked with visiting Muslim communities up and down the country. Now, it seems really naive, but at the time politicians were constantly in search of the Muslim leader of the Muslim community. Now, I as a Muslim, I assure you, the Muslim community in the UK, we don't all get together on a weekend. We're not one homogenous group. But we saw a political shift. We saw a shift at the very highest levels of government in the face of a massive challenge where there was a process had started of engaging with local communities. That could be northwest London, where you traditionally see more Arab Muslims. It could be parts of East London, which are maybe more Bangladeshi in one part and more Pakistani in another. But I think that was the real process where we began to understand the demographics, the makeup, the social side of things. And it's been a learning curve since then, and you don't always get it right. You don't have an R&D facility to work in. But I think the UK has made, at least from a government level, has made some great headway in this in the last decade.
Thank you very much. Another round of questions. In the first row, please. Or the second row.
Again, a very interesting panel. Thank you. Actually, for Mr. Ahmed, as you have all pointed out, I think every country is very specific in terms of how the radicalization works and which communities they target. As you know, in the UK, the Muslim community is much more integrated, and as we saw with people like Jihadi John, came from a middle-class, well-integrated family. So what is it that happens specifically in the UK that encourages this radicalization or the attraction towards the Islamic State? And people like Chowdhury, for example, how much, now that he's in jail, is there something that is being done to prevent a second Chowdhury from coming up? Because, I mean, as you pointed out, he's been very prevalent and very active even before any of this was happening. So the British government was very aware of the fact that this person existed and allowed this person to go on. And we had TV channels that hosted him and promoted him because of freedom of speech, so on and so forth. But yet at the same time, he's someone who was very active in the lives of at least 500 people who are present in the UK. So what is it that can be done to prevent that from happening? And at the same time, working with a society that is very well integrated within the British society. And also just something quite general. I think what we've noticed from the panel is that every country is very country specific. So there can't be a European solution to the problem. I'm guessing it's much more a French solution or a German solution or a British solution. So what is it that can be done in order to make sure that there is a response to this that isn't a stereotyping or a generalization of the problem?
Thank you very much. Christoph Reuter, if you could keep your questions short, would be great.
One remark to what Florian Wetzel said and one question to all three panelists. People in Europe are often misled by the horrible impact of terror attacks, which amount of funds, resources, manpower ISIS has invested in conducting these attacks. And if you compare the amount of professionalism, manpower, patience, money invested in infiltrating hostile groups in Syria or in Iraq or in killing high-level adversaries, the resources invested by ISIS in conducting terror attacks in Europe have indeed been minimal. But often people simply don't see it because they don't see the reality in Syria and Iraq. And the question is, the Danish intelligence, interestingly, came up with a surprising differentiation for mainly the people who have returned from Syria. And Denmark having the second highest per capita number after Belgium of people going. So they had a reason to look after. And they claimed that you can differentiate between the group they call the idealists, who still verbally would support ISIS, would support a lot of things we politically absolutely condemn, but they would not resort to violence. And you have a rather small group which does, and they try to pursue the political or judicial line, try
everything to reintegrate those who pose no danger to society, while the others go to prison as soon as there is anything to find them guilty for. Do you see in the respective countries something similar, that you have people, if you only listen to them, you would love to put them behind bars, but you shouldn't do?
We really have to talk about the definition of a short question. Yeah. I saw a question over there. Yeah, running a little bit out of time. That's the reason why.
It still feels that we are chasing a ghost here in some sense. You know, going to the social housing effect on terrorism, and then if you look at the map of terrorist activities across time. At some point, you would look at England and you see this is a place where terrorism is flourishing in mid-2000 with the attack on the subways. Spain was like that with the attacks on the trains. Italy has not ever been on the map for some reason. Still, I think, why now things are concentrated in France and not in other places? I don't think we have had a convincing answer. We are just looking for this needle in the dark. About what explains the trends. Take, for example, Russia. Of course, I'm including the European group. After all, it is part of the football group in Europe. Russia has a considerable amount of Muslims who feel marginalized there in many ways. And yet, we haven't seen anything, even despite the fact that Russia is engaging in a fierce fight against radical groups, according to everybody. Why? All you need is a lone wolf, all you need is a lorry, a car, a knife, a machete. It's not infrastructure that's lacking. So I still haven't seen a convincing hold of that ghost that travels around, appears here and there. Nothing is really convincing about the analysis so far, given the last 2 days, in my opinion. Thanks.
So the question is for everyone. Okay, one last. Here in the front row, and then we have 5 minutes to answer.
I hesitated to ask the question, but I think it goes. I was encouraged by the last question in a way. Very quickly, it seems that there will always be someone who is unhappy about the way someone dresses, or about some way someone's religion, or about the way someone behaves, etc. And it seems there will always be some very angry souls that are unhappy about something or another, and as a result they feel justified in taking action as a result. And I'm wondering, is there a situation that is perfect, or maybe not perfect, but good enough that we aspire for? And what is that situation? What does it look like? But that's very philosophical. Feel free to answer and feel free to ignore, please.
Okay, we will do our best, I guess. Florence, do you want to start?
Okay, where do I begin? I think what can be done to not generalize the problem? I think it's an excellent question. For a start, I think that what we're doing here, dissecting it by country, is an important starting point, because I'm convinced that even though that makes it a bit confusing at times to find la grande réponse, you know, this is the reason for ISIS and bus, I think it helps us understand it better in the context that we're operating in. For me, it starts actually very much so with this discussion around Islam. If you Google ISIS, you find tons and tons of arguments. Is it Islamic? Is it not Islamic? And then those saying, no, look, they're using all these hadiths that proves that they are, and no others, they're making it up. So this is not the discussion, I think, that will get us forward, because, in my opinion, it distracts in Europe from the main issue that I think drives Europeans into the organization. Now, I think for Saudis, for Lebanese, for Syrians, it might be a different story. But I think for Europeans, the problem is not Islam in the first instance. It has to do very much with the living reality in that country. And again, I come back to the 2005 riots. They caused a state of emergency in France. So there was a huge situation. And it had pretty much the same narrative as the ones pushing people into Daesh today. So you have a situation that has continued to simmer. Don't know if you're aware of the police de proximité that then Interior Minister Sarkozy abolished. So we have not been present in a benign way with our security forces in these areas, just in an aggressive fashion. So we're not, the police de proximité was supposed to get your feeling for the community, for knowing who's at risk of falling into the wrong direction and so forth. So dissecting the problem is a huge prise de tête, because it means that you have so much data that you might be overwhelmed by it. But I think that's the main thing. And I'm glad to see that at the European level, we're already encouraging member states to take individualized approaches to the issue. Now, that doesn't stop us from cooperating more in terms of information exchange and so forth. But we have, for instance, a Sprachregelung. Anyway, so we're not allowed to use the word Islamic State. We use the term Daesh to break this link between the religion and the organization. But the narrative is very strong, and we have presidential elections coming up in France. It is very easy for someone like Marine Le Pen to capitalize on that. You can see, according to surveys, that people today are more hostile towards Muslims than they were 10 years ago in France. So it is a huge amount of work to be done, I think. But related to your question, and then it goes back to the other questions asked, and effectively even the big philosophical and the big frustrated question. What pushes people essentially to join this organization? There is not one answer. As I said earlier, it's a triangle. It has 3 legs to it. There is an individual level. I wrote an article called "The Cult of ISIS," if you want to read that, where I explain how on the individual level, the organization, like Scientology or other cults, taps into a sensation of loss that can be a divorce, job loss, move, whatever, and fills it with meaning. And this is where I think some Europeans struggle. We have everything, you have an iPhone, you have the metro, it's all perfect, but capitalism doesn't give meaning. And I think this is something that maybe as postmodern societies we didn't realize that maybe that's something humans want as well. So that's the one leg. The other leg is, as I already mentioned, the very national component, and I think here we can even go city level. And the last leg is the regional dimension. So where in 2005 Daesh didn't exist, and maybe Al-Qaeda didn't manage to tap into this French narrative, ISIS now does. So there's a constant learning curve going on. But whoever says, I have the one answer, is lying, because it is so bloody complex, and it's so bloody national, that we have to live with the fact, we have to live with complexity. Luckily, that's one thing French people can live with. That there is no easy answer. But on the question on Danish intelligence, I've seen another component actually from Denmark that shows that a lot of the inmates coming from Daesh have ADHD. And so ADHD I don't know if you're familiar with the... so that shows that this is a group of people who fundamentally struggled perhaps from birth to integrate in society. So violence, that's not part of the picture, but being accepted. And this is, I think, the other thing, belonging. Belonging is something that ISIS offers and that our large urban structures don't offer. And another study, although that's not French, so disclaimer, it's done here in Rumiyeh, in Lebanon, Rumiyeh prison, that showed that Daesh supporters all had missing fathers. So you can tell I'm bombarding you with more information that only confuse the picture more, but it just goes to show that we have to respond on all fronts. And I think it has to range from psychology to economy to politics and to security. If we use only one card in the deck, I think we have a problem. Ideologues, I don't think anyone has a problem with that unless, as Mubarak just pointed out, you start supporting publicly and you leave too much space to a discussion that fundamentally questions the basics of our society. But as a German, you know that if democracy is allowed to fight back, a defensive democracy, and I think in that sense there are limits. You can, if you are peaceful, and as a lot of Salafis are, most of them in fact, then there's nothing for you to worry about. It's when you incite to violence. And last point on, is radicalism the norm? It's an interesting question because I don't know where I have this data from, but 5 to 10% of any given society will probably always be radical. But what we don't want is for them to be violent. So the norm is not peace and happiness, sadly, yet. but something a bit lower than that.
Thank you very much, Florence. Mubarak, one question was specifically directed at you. Would you like to answer it?
Sure, but I'm going to have some fun and add to Florence's list of interesting facts that confuse us. There was a study done by 2 academics last year that found that engineers were disproportionately highly represented in all forms of extremism, right-wing and Islamist. So if there's any engineers in the house, I've got my eyes on you.
Under 25.
Yeah, I think echoing what's already been said, there isn't a silver bullet. So if we're trying to find a one-size-fits-all solution, we can keep looking because we won't find it. Those successes that have taken place in counter-extremism efforts have always cited localized efforts, being the most successful. So if we're trying to find local solutions and then at the same time trying to find this big halo that runs over the whole thing, I think there's a paradox there. In terms of the country-specific one, Anjem Choudhury, how do we stop the next one coming out? I think we've done a good enough job in the UK where we don't give people like that the platform, although there's some questions around that. There's also parts of the media that you can't control. You can't ensure who comes on Press TV or Russia Today. So who's giving those platforms? Channel 4, yeah, Channel 4. Well, there's a long list. I think there's still a long way to go there, but there's also the online space, which worries me even more, where these ideas continue to survive. I did an investigation for The Times a couple of weeks ago where we found Mizanur Rahman, the man who was also sent down with Anjem Choudhury. His books were still available for sale on Amazon, despite him being in prison for 6 months on terrorism charges. Thankfully, Amazon, unlike the other big tech companies, responded promptly and removed it from sale. But in the same issue of The Times, I also raised how some of Anjem Choudhury's lectures are still available online, in which he talks about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's unblemished record. He talks about the Islamic State being the sole representative on earth of a proper Sharia state, and that why is the government stopping our people from traveling there? That is still on YouTube. I think while he's behind bars, that's a good move, and some of his followers have either got restrictions on them or they're also behind prison. I think the online space is one area where, whether it's purely a legislative response that compels the tech companies to remove content, or the tech companies themselves realize the danger that such content carries, particularly for such a prolific network or an influencer. But the other area is university campuses. I think it's one of those environments where freedom of expression is so strongly defended, and quite rightly. I think we should be giving platform to ideas and challenging them. But there's a lot of events taking place across campuses in the UK where these ideas aren't being challenged. They're just being given a platform. And I think that's another area that concerns me. And yeah. Also, a side note, there's these new online vloggers that have appeared as well in the last year or so. People like Dawa Man, who follow this strict Salafi tradition, so-called. And he's perpetuating some of the stuff that you hear from ISIS. So lies about the Shia, they're descended from pigs, they're descended from apes, they're created by the Jews. Exactly the same stuff that you would see in Darbik and the Rumiyah. But he's legally doing it. There's no restrictions from YouTube. He's got his own website that he directs you to. And he has the most robust social media presence I've seen for any cleric in the UK across all social media platforms.
Thank you very much. Florian, you will have the honor of having the last word for now.
I think there's still one question open, right? If I understand correctly, with regards to Russia. I'm afraid I cannot comment on that because I'm not familiar with the situation and with regards to Russia. But I'd just like to repeat what you have touched upon and what I've said earlier, that countering radical ideology, I think it's a very exhausting task, and it won't be achieved because, as you said, the radical ideology somewhere on the internet or somewhere else will probably survive. So when we want to make societies more resilient, I think what we have to do is grassroots works, as you mentioned, and from a police perspective, I think it's very important to dismantle the structures that are actually facilitating mobilization. So if we do that, then individuals who might become radicalized, they don't find an opportunity to become active or to actually live their radical, or become active and act upon their radical views. So I think it's almost impossible to contain radical ideology, but we have to stop the activism that is behind it. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think the numbers of questions that could have been posed, and Florence threatening us to bombard us with ever more information, Mubaz threatening to add more factors to the list to confuse us, and Florian raising even more issues, political issues that have to be addressed. I think that shows that we could go on and on with this debate. I think we should close the panel for now, but we will continue, of course, to have this discussion on these topics here in Lebanon, I'm sure. We also have that in Berlin and in the other places Cass is working at. I would really like to thank my panelists for their fabulous presentations, and I would like to ask you to join me.